Let me tell you, first of all, everyone who I've seen today has asked if I will address the situation in the Middle East. Many of you have taken my courses on the Middle East and on Jerusalem, and I will indeed address it in the question and answer period particularly. What I'm going to try to do, because we are doing the 1930s and Winston Churchill at a time when he warned the world. And the question is, did the world listen? So let me begin with this. The dawn of the 1930s saw Winston Churchill out of office, out of step with the party. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. But I want to tell you that in 1932, Winston Churchill was in Munich. And one of Hitler's top aides was a Harvard graduate by the name of Putzi Hanfstaengl. And Putzi, as he was affectionately called by one and all, had been a graduate of Harvard, knew Franklin Roosevelt, spoke English perfectly. And he came to Churchill, who was in Munich, and said, "I'd like you to meet Herr Hitler." And at first, Churchill was interested. But he looked into it a bit. And in the end, he refused to have the meeting with Churchill. And when he was asked why, he responded, "Have you read what Hitler says about the Jews?" Churchill refused to meet with Hitler because of what Hitler said about the Jews. It's very instructive, very important. When Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933 rather, Hitler watched with dismay as Germany rearmed. At the same time, Britain continued a policy of disarmament and appeasement. And maybe it is worth pausing for a moment to define appeasement as Churchill did. An appeaser is one who feeds the crocodile, hoping it will not consume him. Appeasement in itself, said Churchill, may be good or bad according to circumstances. Appeasement from strength is magnanimous and noble, and might be the sure interest and perhaps the only road to world peace. But he also said, it is no use trying to satisfy a tiger by feeding him with cat's treat. This question dominates Churchill. And what I'd like to do now is to try to define it a little bit more. America, this great nation, had withdrawn into isolation, and France was ruled by a dreadful, incompetent Popular Front. William L. Shirer not only wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but he wrote a book about the collapse of the French Republic. Google it. It's worth reading. Well, Churchill sat hunched before his easel, cigar clenched in his teeth, extravagant, hat well down and round his ears. He was, though ostensibly distracted from political cares, ruminating on the situation in Europe. He saw the Weimar Republic, the government which preceded the rise of Hitler, collapse. And he realized the menace of Hitler. Soon, he began to warn the appeasers what Nazi power might inevitably lead to. In 1932, the year before Hitler assumed power in Germany, Churchill was warning Britain of the danger of a resurgent Germany. This is what he said to the House of Commons. Now the demand is that Germany should be allowed to rearm. Do not delude yourselves. Do not let His Majesty's government believe, I am sure, that they do not believe that all that Germany is asking for is equal status. That is not what Germany is seeking. All these bands of sturdy Teutonic youths marching through the streets and the roads of Germany with a light of desire in their eyes to suffer for their fatherland are not looking for status. They are looking for weapons. And when they have the weapons, believe me, they will then ask for the return of lost territories and lost colonies. Churchill may have been wrong on India, may have in his career made many errors, but not when it came to his understanding of the threat that was emerging in Germany. In 1938, after the fall of Austria, Churchill rose from his habitual front corner seat in the House, head thrust forward, thumbs in his vest pocket, scolded, lectured the House of Commons and the House Conservative government on the 5 years they had wasted failing to rearm. For 5 years, he said, I have talked to this House of these matters, not with very great success. I have watched this famous island descending inconsistently, frecklessly, the stairway which leads to a clear gulf. It is a fine, broad stairway at the beginning, and after a bit, the carpet wears. A little further on, there are only flagstones. And a little further on still, these break your feet. Now, he thundered, is the time to rouse the nation. Perhaps it is the last time it can be roused. The chance of preventing war, or the chance of coming through to victory through our efforts to prevent war. We should lay aside every hindrance and endeavor by uniting the whole force and spirit of our people to raise again a great British nation, standing up before all the world. For such a nation, riding in its ancient vigor, can even at this hour save civilization. I want to reflect with you on the fact that all of this melodrama did not wear well with many people. Winston was an hysteric. Winston was a drunk. Winston was past his prime. But there is more to the story, and I want to explain it. World War I had a shattering effect on Great Britain. But not just Great Britain, on Europe, on America. We had watched the flower of youth cut down in a senseless war. We had seen destruction of empires. We had seen fields go fallow. We had seen young men coming back from war, if they were lucky enough to be able to, walking on crutches, being wheeled through the streets. We had seen the most devastating impact. There was a man by the name of Neville Chamberlain. He had been mayor of Birmingham. He had been a man who had built housing for people, encouraged industry and jobs for people, made Birmingham a hub of development and growth. But there is more to the story. Churchill's best friend and closest confidant was his first cousin, who was cut down in the opening days of the war. Churchill had gone to war and seen the impact of war. Churchill's response was, "We must never be taken by surprise again." Chamberlain's reaction was, "We must do everything we can to avoid war. Everything that we can to avoid war." And you all understand the anguish of that generation. We tend to view appeasement as a negative term. How many of you in your own personal lives have chosen to appease rather than confront? How many of us have denied the reality of certain situations in the hope that we would avoid disastrous consequences? When Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons on the 7th of February, 1934, he tried to warn. We are engaged in imposing equality of armies as far as we can upon the nations of the continent, France, Germany, Poland, Italy. Suppose it is asked in a few years why there should be equality of nations. 2, when the governments are asked about this, they say, no, that would not apply. We should not agree to that. Suppose we are asked sometime in the future to restore colonies, which we hold as a mandate. The government should say, certainly not. We should not open that question in any way. And then Churchill looked at the House of Commons and he said, you will say, no, we do not agree. Armies, they belong to other people. Navies, they question effects of Britain's interests. But we are banned and bound to say no. Churchill appealed magnificently to Britain to be prepared. It seems, he said, that there are 3 definitions of decisions which we should now take at once and without any delay. The first affects the army. We ought to begin the reorganization of our civil factories so they can be turned over rapidly to war purposes. And then the Navy. He demanded that Britain re-outfit its Navy. Be prepared. And then, looking to the future, he said, then there is the air. I cannot conceive how, in the present state of Europe and of our position in Europe, we can delay in establishing the principles of having an air force, at least as strong as that of any power that can get at us. I think that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It would only begin to put us back in the position which we brought up. We have lived under the shield of the Navy. To have an air force as strong as the Air Force of France or Germany, whichever is the stronger, ought to be the decision which Parliament should take, which the national government should proclaim. I want you to stop and think. This is 1932. Hitler is not in power. Britain is in the middle of a depression. There are huge economic problems. And he had the chutzpah to say to comrades, we must prepare. We must spend money. We cannot hesitate. The future of our race, as he put it, our empire, is at stake. And he was ridiculed. He was laughed at. He was not given a cabinet position, nor any place of stature in British life. He made his income by writing books and newspaper articles, by touring and speaking, because of his brilliance. In the autumn of 1936, Churchill became convinced that Germany was now stronger in air power than Britain and France combined. And in early November, he had urged the Prime Minister to allow a full-scale two-day debate on defense. During that debate, Churchill delivered the speech I've just quoted you, which was undoubtedly one of the very greatest of his career, which made a real impact on the Commons, but wasn't enough, even by Churchill standards. The documentation was remarkably full, the rhetoric unusually powerful, and the argument brilliantly framed. His style, one of the leading British observers, Harold Nicholson, said, recorded and wrote, is more considered and slower than usual, but he drives his point home with a sledgehammer. The sentence beginning, so they go on in strange paradox, decided only to be undecided, which certainly ranks as one of Churchill's finest lines. Even the London Times, so often hostile to him during this period, described the speech as brilliant. You remember the line from Shakespeare? Full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, gave a limp and lame reply. His famous appalling frankness speech only served to increase the sense of unease which MPs felt in light of Churchill's remarks. The Prime Minister's reputation appeared to be in serious decline, but the sudden eruption of the abdication crisis, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, dramatically restored his prestige and diminished Churchill's prestige. What do you do when you see the writing on the wall? When you know what's going to happen? When you cry out with all your vigor? When you are absolutely certain that you are correct? Full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. how frustrating it must have been for Winston Churchill to stand before Parliament with all the power of his oratory and still fail to convince. And there's more. We read today about leaks, right? Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty, the man in charge of the colonies, still had contacts throughout the British secret state, if you will. And he was supplied regularly with statistics, with information, with material to demonstrate graphically what Britain faced. As you will see, I believe, in the movie that I hope you will watch next week at 3 o'clock, the British cabinet could not imagine where Churchill was getting his information. It was supposed to be secret. Thank God for leaks. And then came Munich. I do not know. I cannot imagine what it must have been like in 1938 when everything hung on the brink and Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany and met with Adolf Hitler. Now, interestingly enough, I have recordings of all the broadcasts that were made by Edward R. Murrow, by William L. Shirer, by the great correspondents of those days. And I sat quietly for a few moments to listen. You can go online. Edward R. Murrow's I Can Hear It Now. You won't hear all of the speeches, but you will hear how Murrow and his team, Murrow's boys, as they were called, recorded the events leading up to Munich. You must imagine in your own minds the relief that Britain felt on the cusp of war. They had a prime minister who was willing to give everything. And appeasement, my friends, became a noble concept, not an ignoble concept. On the 30th of September, 1938, Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich, bearing what he believed was Hitler's reassurance of peace in our time. Remember the image? He gets off the plane. I have here in my hand a piece of paper signed by the German Chancellor. You can see it on YouTube. You can hear it if you listen to Edward R. Murrow's I Can Hear It Now. Somebody asked me once how I fell in love with history, aside from reading. I got the original recording, I Can Hear It Now, by Edward R. Murrow, 1933 to 1941. I still listen to it without having to put a phonograph record on the Victrola, as it was once called, because you can get it on YouTube. For a brief interlude, my friends, Neville Chamberlain was the most popular man in Great Britain. His parliamentary majority was never in doubt. But during the Commons debate on the Munich Agreement, often referred to as the settlement, which lasted from the 3rd to the 6th of October of 1938, some very powerful speeches were made in opposition to the betrayal of Czechoslovakia, especially by Duff Cooper, who was he'd resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty, Archibald Sinclair, Clement Attlee, one of the leaders of the Labour Party, Anthony Eden, who was Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary, and who resigned from the government and joined Churchill, which, by the way, secured his future because he succeeded Churchill as Prime Minister. As so often, it was Churchill who spoke late in the debate for 49 minutes. Just 49 minutes. You'll hear the recreation in the movie, but you can actually listen if you Google Winston Churchill, because he recorded the speech. He provided another superb oration, the most damning indictment of all. By the way, imagine, please, delivering a speech opposing the most popular move. Chamberlain had prevented war. He had brought peace in our time. Consider, if Hitler had not invaded Czechoslovakia, it would not have been inconceivable that the Nobel Prize for Peace would have been presented to Chamberlain and Hitler. The Daily Telegraph believed in his warnings, by now increasingly verified by events. He said these views are entitled to be heard. In the final vote, 30 conservative parliamentarians abstained. The most convincing demonstration yet of the opposition to Chamberlain within the ranks of his own party, his own supporters. By this time, however, feeling against Churchill in the conservative bench was very strong indeed. Remember, Churchill had previously deserted the Conservative Party. Then he came back to the Conservative Party. The old-timers didn't trust him. His word was not good. The Times claimed that he treated a crowded house to prophecies which made the prophet Jeremiah seem like an optimist. Read the book of Jeremiah. Unfortunately, most people don't read or study the Bible in the context, not of what it means theologically, but what it meant historically. Even Beaverbrook's Daily Express dismissed Churchill's speech as, and I quote directly, an alarmist oration by a man whose mind is soaked with the conquests of Marlborough. Somebody joked, is soaked with bottles of brandy. How do you describe all of this? This is what Churchill said, the final lines of his oration. I do not begrudge our loyal, brave people who are ready to do their duty, no matter what the cost, who never flinched under the strain of the last week. I do not grudge against them the natural, spontaneous outbursts of joy and relief when they learned that the hard ordeal of war would no longer be required of them at the moment, but they had and should know the truth. You know the relief that Britain, that had gone through the First World War and its devastating effects, and who feared mightily the idea that once again they would be confronted with war? Do you understand the relief they felt? Churchill most certainly understood it. They should know the truth, he said. They should know that there has been gross neglect and deficiencies in our defenses. They should know that we have sustained a defeat without a war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along our road. They should know that we have passed an awful milestone in our history, when the whole equilibrium of Europe, which has been deranged, and the terrible words have for the time being been pronounced against the Western democracies. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. And do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year unless there is a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor. We must rise again and take our stand for freedom as in olden times. Churchill described this triumph of diplomacy as a total and unmitigated disaster. Churchill reflected earlier in the speech, I have been casting about to see how measures can be taken to protect us from the advance of Nazi power and to secure those forms of life which are so dear to us. What is the sole method that is open? The sole method that is open for us to regain our old island independence by acquiring that supremacy in the air which we were promised, that security in our air defenses which we were assured we had, and thus to make ourselves an island once again. That in all of this grim outlook shines out an overwhelming fact. An effort of rearmament, the likes of which has never been seen, ought to be made forthwith. And all the resources of this country and all its united strength should be bent to the task. Dramatic words by a man certainly prone to high drama. Was he right? Was he correct? Or was he delusional, as he had been about India? When I was in school, one of my majors, I had a triple major in college: political science, religion, and speech. And I read an essay by René Rapin, which I will perhaps allude to next week, who said that what makes a great orator is the merger of the man, the times, and the speech. When we talk about Churchill as an orator, which we will do next week, I think we will better understand the merger of these concepts. Churchill was a lucky man. Churchill was a lone voice amid the rejoicing for peace. The cheers for Chamberlain as peacemaker, however, stilled to a deadly silence when Nazi troops marched into Prague. It is not hard to understand the appeal of appeasement. I'll address the question about the Middle East in a few moments, because every one of you practically has asked me to do it. But I wanted clearly to spell out for you Winston Churchill. The British, during this time, were learning. To their consternation, the desire for peace, the avid wish for peace, does not necessarily ensure peace. After the laissez-faire of Baldwin, the pacifism of Ramsay MacDonald, and the appeasement of Chamberlain, a day of reckoning was about to occur. My friends, a price would have to be paid for those years, the locust years as they were called, the squandered opportunities. The price was war. The price, well, beyond measure. I want just to conclude this, and then I'll spend a few minutes on the Middle East. I have to give you your break. There are a lot of cookies to eat. All week, I have been in anguish over what is happening even as I speak. How do you know what the right thing to do is? I mean, really, how do you know? How can you be certain? And what happens even when warning is given and you can go back in time and say, it was all there for you to see, and yet you were blind? What happens when recrimination flies? Hindsight, as the cliche goes, is 20/20. There is a NPR series done many years ago about Churchill in exile. It's about Churchill in the 1930s. You can Google it. You can watch it. I think it's about 8 or 9 hours of very entertaining television. Brilliantly done. It's called The Wilderness Years. Churchill, The Wilderness Years. If this were a 5-day-a-week class for 6 months, I would have used some of the clips. I would have insisted, if you were students, that you watch that. Why? Because of its brilliance in articulating the paradoxes. What do you do when you know you are right? When you have absolute certainty, as Churchill did, and you have the ability to speak to an audience in spellbinding terms. And when you are done, it is as if a tree fell in a forest. and there was no one there to hear the sound. I have wrestled with this, not only in the context of trying to imagine the frustration Winston Churchill felt, but also our frustration with today's events. So I want to pause, give you a chance to eat some cookies, take a break, come back in 10 minutes, and we'll pick it up, and I'll deal with the Middle East in the context of all of this. Take 10, no more.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, please. One of your classmates offered me very constructive criticism. She said I need to put more feeling and more expression into it. Well, in a way, you know, when you teach a course like this on Winston Churchill, you, at least I, try to put myself in the position of how he must have felt. And I will confess to you, having been a public speaker for most of my life, beginning in the second grade, I realized that part of the art of public speaking is holding the attention of your class with the appropriate dramatic emphasis. All right. I was asked by virtually all of you, and I have received Derek's permission to address a little bit about the Middle East. May I just ask by show of hands, how many of you have taken my courses on either the Middle East or Jerusalem? Oh, I figured about half of them. This has been an extremely painful week. Some of you will recall that when, in 2008, Random House published our book, Icon of Evil, Hitler's Mufti and the Rise of Radical Islam, I spoke here and did a book signing here at the Fromm. That book became a bestseller, but received great criticism. The criticism was, as Tom Segev wrote in his review in the New York Times, that it was a good book in the sense that it told a story, but the problem was that it stated truths which we did not need to hear, and that it might obstruct the peace process. In the paperback edition of our book, Alan Dershowitz called me and asked if he could write the introduction at no charge to the paperback, which we graciously agreed to. What provoked him to call me was the fact that he read the review in the New York Times, and he was horrified. It is important to teach history objectively. And by the way, next week, I will share with you Winston Churchill's words when Neville Chamberlain died. Because I want you to understand that even when you know you're right, you can appreciate the position of someone who opposed you. These last 10 days have been among the most difficult of my life. I have taught this subject. I have traveled throughout the Middle East. I spent countless hours in Gaza. I've known most of the major players, at least on the Israeli side, since the days of Golda Meir. I've been asked to speak in the East Bay in a couple of weeks about the new movie about Golda Meir, which, if you haven't seen it, is well worth seeing. Helen Mirren does a magnificent job of portraying the most difficult hours of Golda. Sometimes you make the wrong decision. Golda found out that 50 years ago, the War of Yom Kippur, or the October War, was about to break out. Dado Elazar, who was the chief of staff of the Israeli army, came to Golda and said, "You must mobilize. We have to strike preemptively." Dado's closest friend was David Applebaum, who owned David's Delicatessen here in town. Dado never recovered from what happened. And in a sense, neither did Golda. They were warned by President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger that if Israel acted preemptively, the United States would not support Israel. Golda did at the moment what she thought was the right thing. It proved to be the burden of catastrophe, which she carried with her for the rest of her life. There was no warning in this situation. Hamas, with practiced efficiency, prepared for 2 years with training bases just over the border. In our book, we cited the Hamas covenant. Please don't believe me. Google the Hamas covenant and read Article 7. It defines the problem and why there has been such anguish, not only by the people of Israel, but by Jews everywhere. Article 7 of the Hamas covenant quotes from the Hadith, the commentary on the Quran. And it says, if a Jew should hide behind a rock or a tree, let the rock or the tree cry out, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him. It doesn't say Israeli. It says Jew. And I want to begin with a simple fact that Jewish institutions in Europe, in the United States, every corner of the world now have police protection, army protection. Someone asked me, why do you Jews care so much? It was not an attack on Israel alone. It was an attack on Jews. There was a great Jewish writer and philosopher who I had the pleasure of meeting on several occasions by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel. He wrote a book called Israel, Echo of Eternity. Heschel was a great Jewish scholar, but also someone who believed strongly in the ecumenical world. And a Christian colleague asked him, as the Six-Day War was concluding, why do you Jews care so much? And in this particular structure, which used to be a chapel, Heschel responded, imagine there is only one copy of the Bible left in the world, and you see it being thrust into flames and fire. "30 years almost to the day after the Yom Kippur War, in the lifetime of many who survived the Holocaust. Indeed, one survivor has been kidnapped. The horror of what happened a week ago Saturday is so horrific as for me to say clearly, it was inconceivable. Men, women, children. On some of the kibbutzim, all of whom were left-wingers, all of whom worked with the people in Gaza for their security and peace. Wholesale slaughter. A woman who assisted with childbirth, who had assisted thousands of women, Jew and Arab, in delivery of their children, was brutally slaughtered. Perhaps most disagreeable for me was watching a fellow on CNN by the name of Tom. His daughter, Emily, 8 years old, was dead. And on TV, and you can see it if you go to CNN, he says of his now deceased daughter, Emily, "Thank God she's dead." And I think we all, when we saw it, were incredulous. I can't imagine saying such a thing. But then he said, imagine if she had been kidnapped, raped, tortured, brutalized. Thank God, he said, she is dead. She will not suffer that. Can you imagine, please, a parent expressing that sentiment? It is true that there is anger in Israel. But it is also true, if you have listened, and I watched last night on CNN, to the 1 hour Anderson Cooper did on the music festival and the horrific slaying of Hamas terrorists laughing and rejoicing as they murdered people. I could not help but reflect that even as Churchill tried to alert people, we could not imagine such a thing. Who could imagine in their wildest thinking such inhumanity, such barbarism? I taught a course here some years ago on ethnic conflict. And in that class, I used the Holocaust as an example. It was ethnic cleansing at its worst. And I brought in all of the material I had published in the 1930s about Hitler's intent toward the Jews, including the speech he gave on January the 30th, 1939, in which Hitler proclaimed, and you can Google it, you can hear it, that if war broke out caused by the Jews, the result would be the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. Extermination. And I laid it out. I mean, I had 30, 40 different articles, books, quotes from books, all the rest. Who could have believed that such a thing was serious? We are taught in Jewish tradition that if somebody says they're coming to kill you, you should believe them. But how do you believe in something so horrible? It is inconceivable. I will confess I've slept very little this last week and few days. I wept. I've been very active in the Jewish community. I had the privilege of being president of the Bay Area Council for Soviet Jews. I led all the demonstrations in front of the Soviet consulate on Green Street. And you know, who used to come to the demonstration were the Hadassah ladies, the older people, and the school kids. And they would bus in the school kids who were 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. And I thought to myself, do they know why they are here? And so I would ask the kids a question, 1,000 kids in front of me. How many of you have parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents who came from the Soviet Union or Russia or Eastern Europe? And the hands would fly up. And I would say, now, please put your hands down and consider this. If your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents had not fled, it would not be them that we are protesting for. It would be you. I still have people much younger than I who say, oh, I remember you. You're the guy who asked us that question. I've always believed that no one should do anything they don't understand. As a teacher, I have often in class asked at the end of a class, what have you learned? Because my feeling as a teacher is if you haven't learned something at the end of the class, the teacher has failed. So what do we face in the next few weeks? I'll try to summarize it so we have time for questions. First of all, there is only one party to blame for what is happening, and that is Hamas. They are the ones who unleashed the terror. Israel has amassed its forces on the border of Gaza, 400,000 strong. And people have asked me, how do you feel about Israel going into Gaza? I have to tell you, I regret it profoundly. Sometimes people talk about vengeance. This is not vengeance. The Israelis are saying, we want to ensure this never happens again. It is going to be a terrible few weeks and months and perhaps longer. I would remind you that Israel withdrew every settlement and every Jew from Gaza. That was at the insistence of Ariel Sharon, hardline Prime Minister of Israel. We used to say about Arik that he was like a bull who carried with him his own china shop. He took a gamble. He said, we're pulling out. We're giving it back to the Gazans, to the Palestinians, to the Palestinian Authority. They can make the decision as to whether or not Gaza will become the Singapore of the Middle East. And I've been in Gaza, believe me. The beaches are spectacular. The resort possibilities were amazing. The Israelis had hot houses producing some of the most beautiful orchids and so forth in the world. And Israel offered all of that. First thing the Palestinians did, and it was the Palestinians, not just Hamas, was to blow up the hothouses. But there was still hope. And then the people of Gaza voted for Hamas over the Palestinian Authority. Now, by the way, they had a perfect right to do it. The Palestinian Authority was incompetent, corrupt, horrific. But the Palestinian Authority was still there, and so Hamas conducted a revolution, and they threw the Palestinian Authority out. Now, we should have had a clue when they threw members of the Palestinian Authority executive off the roof of tall buildings in Gaza. They threw them off the roof. I have been asked, what will the end result be? When we went to war against Germany and Italy and Japan, do you remember what we demanded? Unconditional surrender. No conditions. Everything must stop. And do you remember the bombing of Dresden? Do you remember the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The brutality of war. And yet out of the ashes of that cataclysmic explosion of human passion, democracy arose. In Germany, Western Germany, Konrad Adenauer, who had been the mayor of Cologne, who had been anti-Nazi, became the head of the German government. And Germany constructed a democracy. And in Japan, thanks to Douglas MacArthur, about whom we could talk extensively in the pros and cons, and Emperor Hirohito, who was the great villain during World War II. You're all old enough to remember the depictions of Hirohito, buck teeth and all. Japan evolved into a democracy. I remember when my old boss, Richard Nixon, who fought in the Second World War, welcomed Emperor Hirohito to this country. And I remember when I had the pleasure of seeing Hirohito here in San Francisco, dedicating the Japanese Peace Memorial on Geary. When you drive down Geary, he was there. I was there. I wanted to see what he looked like. The only hope we can have is that out of the ashes of this horrific week, more Jews died in one place that Saturday than at any time since the Holocaust. Let that sink in for a moment. More Jews died in one day at one place at any time since the Holocaust. But in Israel, there is hope that maybe with the destruction of Hamas, something else will arise. Now, there's a danger, and I want to be clear. For every action, there is a reaction. When the Israelis go in, there will be great brutality. The pictures that will emerge will be horrifying. And there are many who will say there is no justification for the brutality of war. And perhaps they're right. Innocent men, women, and children will die. But I hope that out of this, something new will emerge, as it did in Germany and Japan. There is another danger. I want to address it directly, and that is Hezbollah in Lebanon. As the Iranians armed Hamas, they have also armed Hezbollah. There are 150,000 rockets. Now, when I left home at around noon, some skirmishes had taken place on the border of Lebanon, and the Israelis have evacuated all of the settlements along the border with Lebanon. It is not Lebanon that is the target. Even as Hamas has taken over Gaza, Hezbollah has taken over southern Lebanon. There is no Lebanese government. Go back and listen to my class. I described that. I've described it in every class I've taught here on the Middle East. Why has the United States dispatched the Ford and the Eisenhower to the Mediterranean? Two great ships that are symbols of American might. It is to send a message to Hezbollah and to Iran. If those missiles fly, the United States will stand by Israel even more dramatically. I want to tell you, Iron Dome is a fairly effective method of preventing missiles from coming in. But it's not 100%. And let's assume they fire with 150,000 missiles. Let's assume they fire 200 each night, 300 each night, 1,000 each night. Iron Dome will be no protection. Tel Aviv, Haifa, the north of Israel, it'll be catastrophic. This morning, the sirens went off in Jerusalem, and the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, had to recess just in case. I want you to understand, I'm trying to give you as clear a picture as I can. Yesterday, on Venezuelan television, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, finally condemned Hamas and then issued a retraction. Why? He issued a retraction because if free democratic elections were held on the West Bank, Hamas would win. Now, many of you know that I've described in some detail the idea of a two-state solution. Let me explain that if Hamas controls the West Bank, Israel at its narrowest is 9 miles wide. I know people who jog 9 miles every day. I am not one of them. No Israeli government, no clear-thinking person would permit a Palestinian state on the West Bank. There are some who say, but if there's a Palestinian state, there will be peace. Read the Hamas covenant. I can almost hear myself as Winston Churchill saying, read Mein Kampf. Listen to what they say. I do not say this in anger. I say this in sadness. In sadness for the people of Israel. In sadness for the people of Gaza. In sadness for all of those who have suffered because of the ongoing conflict that exists and has existed in the Middle East. But in Israel, there are two expressions which everyone should remember. In Hebrew, ein brera, no alternative. And an expression in English made popular after the Holocaust, never again. I can be, and I've tried to be, somewhat dispassionate in analyzing the political situation. 3 cheers for Joe Biden, whether you like him or you don't like him. His talk on behalf of Israel was the most eloquent statement he has made as President of the United States. And the expectation is, and I'm here, so I'm not listening to the news, that he may be in Israel by the end of the week. I know when I came in, some of his appointments for the next few days have been canceled. The expectation is he will fly to Israel. That's what a president of the United States does to exhibit courage. I worked for Richard Nixon. A lot of you know that. Some of you took my course, which I've taught, on the life and times of Richard Nixon. After the Yom Kippur War, Nixon flew to Israel, June of 1974. And he was cheered because Richard Nixon saved Israel. A Republican president, who, by the way, had not the best reputation when it came to Jews. You can Google my article. All you have to do is John Rothmann, Richard Nixon, and the Jews. It's about 800 words. And it's now quoted everywhere because it describes Nixon's attitude toward the Jews and how he saved Israel. Joe Biden is a Democrat. And Joe Biden is trying to help ensure that Israel survives. I first met Joe Biden when I would go to Washington. Some of you remember former Congressman Tom Lantos. Before Tom was elected to Congress, he served on Joe Biden's staff as his economic advisor. When I was in Washington, I would go to Joe Biden's office in the late afternoon to sit with Tom Lantos. This is before Tom was in Congress. And Joe Biden used to drop by. And I got to know him, relatively well. He'd only spend a short time, maybe an hour. And then he would get on the train to rush home because he wanted to put his boys to bed after his wife and infant daughter were killed in a tragic accident. I've never experienced the kind of love, devotion that Joe Biden felt for his kids, which explains a lot about his conduct now. And Joe Biden, knowing of my interest in Israel, and Tom Lantos, by the way, was the first Holocaust survivor to serve in Congress. He was from Hungary. He's the guy who was responsible for the legislation making Raoul Wallenberg an honorary U.S. citizen. You know the other one there? There's several others. But at that time, it was Winston Churchill and Lafayette and Raoul Wallenberg. Why do I mention that? Because I heard Joe Biden speak about Israel with such passion, privately and publicly. And believe it or not, in those days, Joe Biden, then in his 30s, was powerful, unencumbered by age. Joe Biden acted decisively and is a great friend of Israel. And Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is now involved in shuttle diplomacy. Anthony Blinken is a Jew. You remember the last Secretary of State who conducted shuttle diplomacy? Henry Kissinger, a Jew. And 3 cheers for Secretary of Defense Austin. Because I'm not sleeping well and I keep the TV set on all night, I listened at 4:15 the other morning to Austin's remarks. Powerful, compelling, direct, no equivocation. I don't have an answer. And I know you have questions and I will take them. I just want you to understand Somebody asked me walking in, what would Winston Churchill have said? I described to you that Winston Churchill called himself a Zionist, that Winston Churchill was devoted to Israel, that even in his last years, when he was asked, he said, I am a Zionist. I have always been a Zionist. I believe that the Jews have a right to a home. That is how I draw the parallel between this class and what has happened. I also want you to think about what appeasement means. How many crocodiles do we feed, hoping they won't consume us? Just one last thing. When you go home, drive by a Jewish institution. Drive by any synagogue in San Francisco. Drive by the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco. And you will see police. Why? You heard the bell toll. The feeling is it might toll for me or for you. All right, let me take questions. Yes, I'll be quick. I'm going to keep you here till 1:15, okay? I'm going to stay a little bit after. I'm giving you warning. So let me start. And I'll answer quickly. Yes. Yes. Question is first about Putin. Putin condemned Israel the other day for excessive force. And he is, oh, good, I got a laugh on that line. But also, please note that China now is criticizing Israel as well. China, Russia, and Iran are now aligned. Israel understands that its friends in the West, meaning the United States, Western Europe, I include Japan in that, which has been steadfast in its support. There is, unfortunately, an alliance which is not reasonable. What about Ukraine? If I had time, I would describe to you the paradox of the Republican Party in the spring of 1940, when isolationists, led by Robert Taft and others in the Republican Party, confronted Wendell Willkie. Willkie saved the Republican Party, saved England, urged the United States to embrace internationalism. By the way, Willkie was a great Zionist as well. All you have to do is read Philip Roth's novel about America. What if we'd elected Lindbergh as president? What if Bob Taft had won? I mean, the Republican Party today is deeply divided. And I tell you, it's a real test. What Donald Trump said about Hezbollah and Israel is shameful, aside from everything else. Let me also say the Democratic Party has its problems with the Squad and the people on the far left, but the Republican Party has its problems with the far right, and it's shameful. Next question. Yes. Okay, question is about gaslighting the Palestinian demonstrations. I know all of you, I believe many of you know, that from the 1974, basically, until I got married in 1987, I traveled and spoke on college campuses throughout the United States and Europe on behalf of Israel. I never accepted a nickel for that work. All I asked is room and board and transportation. There is no change. Same thing existed on the college campuses then. They will try to change the narrative. You heard what happened at Harvard University. and where finally the president of Harvard was finally forced to make an appropriate statement after declining to do so. All I can say is we have to answer it with everything we have. And this is not a right-wing, left-wing issue. Let me be clear. Yes, all the way in the back. Yeah. There is a journalist. Yeah. There is a journalist who is trying to negotiate a deal with Hamas. I have to go back behind the podium so that the camera doesn't take away. I apologize to those who are listening to this by recording. With deep regret, there is no compromise with Hamas. They are evil. They don't keep their word. If they negotiate a deal, it will be for prisoners or Hamas members that are held in Israel. But I wouldn't trust Hamas as far as I could throw them. You cannot make a deal with the devil. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Question is about cutting off water and food. First of all, do you know why the electricity was cut in Gaza? The Israelis didn't cut it. Hamas did. They blew up the towers. As for water, there was a problem, and Israel restored the water. Who is blocking Palestinians who have been warned, telling them to go south? Hamas. You don't believe me? You don't have to. All you have to do is watch television, for God's sake. And I don't mean Fox. I mean CNN or MSNBC or ABC, NBC, or CBS. War is not pretty. And Israel will do things that, frankly, I would find abhorrent. But may I say, when we bombed Dresden, when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was abhorrent too. Yes, ma'am. But the question is about the media, and Tom Friedman came up. I love his writing. I'm not a fan of his views. I never have been. Going way back when he wrote a book called Beirut and Jerusalem, which was his first bestseller. The section on Beirut is brilliant. The section on Jerusalem is appalling. I listen to the CBS hourly news on KCBS. It's roughly 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes at the top of every hour. Not for opinion, but for fact. I must tell you that I cannot listen to Fox, although I flip to it because occasionally something emerges which I find of interest, particularly the college campus question, although I don't necessarily agree with their slant. CNN has done an exemplary job. Now, I have to tell you, I have a bias. Wolf Blitzer and I were students together at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1968. We spent a summer together. I consider him to be a trustworthy journalist. I've been very impressed by Donna Bash. I never knew she was Jewish. I never knew until she walked in Auschwitz with Wolf, and they did a special on it. But I find the others, Caitlin Collins, who has been covering, they're doing an exceptional job. If a network deserves, not since Edward R. Murrow and the Murrow boys covering Europe on radio in 1938 and 39 and 40, have I seen such brilliant reporting. And it doesn't mean that I like everything they do, but for accuracy. You ask about journalists. I can tell you before a column is written whether it'll be pro or con. I read them both. Please understand, I cannot talk about this subject, and those of you who took my course on the Arab-Israeli conflict know when I presented the Palestinian case, I had students in class who were furious at me because I presented it better than the Palestinians do. Believe me, I understand. But that's my recommendation for media. Yes. Okay. Yeah. The answer is Israel and pressure. Yes, pressure is put on Israel, and Israel does respond to pressure. Israel has no intention of occupying Gaza. I can tell you, I was there when Israel occupied Gaza and after. They're not going to occupy Gaza, but they're going to level it. And there are some who would say that is awful, and you're right. It is awful. But what's the alternative? These next few days, and I hope I don't have to talk about it next week at all. I have too much to cover with Churchill. I got Derek's permission to do this. I just want you all to know that. What is going to happen in the next few days is going to be dreadful. I dread it. But friends of mine in Israel who are very far to the left, consider what is happening now an existential threat. If Nasrallah continues to engage in this and the rockets fly, if Hamas is resupplied as they have been, that's why the sirens keep going off, what else can they do? I mean, really and truly. You know, in the middle of the night when I was working on KGO, sometimes it got quiet, and whenever the beginning of August rolled around, I would ask the question, should the United States have dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima? Now, I had 2 to 4 million people listening in those days because it was the middle of the night. And with a 50,000 watt station, it went everywhere. And I realized there was a divide. Older people said yes, they should have dropped the bomb, particularly veterans of the Second World War. My father, by the way, who was in the 77th Division and was a physician, told me the story that he had been told to be ready after the invasion of Japan for mass casualties. Do you know that soldiers who served in the Pacific who were going to be involved in that invasion, if it happened, were told to write letters home saying goodbye? And my father, a veteran of the war, said, and a doctor and a humanitarian, said, thank God they dropped the bomb. The divide that I see now is very interesting. Among older people who have memory, there is a complete understanding of what Israel is doing. Not an acceptance of the violence, but an understanding of why. But among younger people, and there's a poll that CNN did today, younger people don't get it. They don't understand the history. One of the things which we have failed to do is to teach the paradoxes as Churchill faced in the 1930s. Appeasement, compromise. When do you finally say you can't compromise anymore? Well, when do you finally say enough is enough? So what I learned from this is younger people always said, couldn't they have done something else? But people who faced the front lines understood. And in Israel, the most interesting thing to me is Netanyahu has been a polarizing figure over this whole question of judicial reform. All of you followed it in the news. And I have to tell you, I'm a great critic of Bibi, and I've known him for many years. but the whole country is now united with him. His most severe critics, including Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, are supporting this government because Israel believes it faces an existential threat. I can tell you, if there's a problem with Iran, there are two things that are going to get hit. The oil production, not the oil fields, but the production, and the nuclear facility in Tehran and in Iran. I will tell you now, the most terrifying thing I could imagine in my life would be Iran having a nuclear capability. You understand, if a Hiroshima-type bomb, not a hydrogen bomb, a low-grade Hiroshima-type bomb were dropped on Tel Aviv, 2 to 3 million people would be destroyed in a flash of an eye. The Israelis understand what this was in Gaza, a foretaste of what could happen. Let me take one more. Yes. Two more. I'll do both of you. First, you. The question is, could there be a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran? Israel will not be alone. Both President Biden and Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, all of them, have said that they understand Iran. That's why the Eisenhower and the Ford are there. And the last question. Yes. Where does Hamas get its funding? From Iran. They get their funding, they get their training, they get their weapons from Iran. Okay, now wait, I haven't dismissed you yet. The power of being an instructor. Next week, we will deal with Winston Churchill in 1939, 40, maybe 41. We only have 3 sessions after this, and I have so much to cover and so little time. It reminds me of Churchill, who was once accused of being a drunk, and he said, "Madam," she was a prohibitionist, "there is so much drinking to do and so little time." So let's hope the news is better. Thank you for your indulgence. Next week.
Israel nukes Iran?
No.
Not even, not preemptive?
No, there's
But
no
for
need.
survival?
No, there's no need.
No?
No. The United States would handle it. There's no need.
I hope you're right.